on the U.S. on September 11, 2001. In 2003, he embedded with the U.S. Navy's Devil Docks Medical Unit, reporting from Iraq and Kuwait as the unit traveled to Baghdad. He provided live coverage on the first operation performed during the war and performed life-saving brain surgery 5 times himself in a desert operating room. Gupta's passion for inspiring Americans to lead healthier, more active lives led him to launch Fit Nation, CNN's multi-platform anti-obesity initiative. And in 2009, Fit Nation followed the progress of Gupta and 6 CNN viewers as they inspired each other while training for a triathlon. And that program is now in its 3rd year. So in addition to his work for CNN, he is a member of the staff and faculty at the Emory University School of Medicine. He is Associate Chief of Neurosurgery at Grady Memorial Hospital and regularly performs surgery at Emory University and Grady. He holds memberships in the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, Congress of Neurological Surgeons, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan and doctorate of medicine from the University of Michigan, so he's a diehard Wolverine. He's married and has 3 daughters, and just one other thing I thought, that you may not know that might be a little unusual about Dr. Gupta. He learned that he was part of the Glee Club also in Michigan, so I'm not sure if he'll incorporate that into his or not. But we're really pleased and honored that you're here with us today, Dr. Gupta, and please join me in welcoming Sanjay Gupta.
I really enjoy being able to do these sorts of things. I don't get a chance to talk to real live people very often. This is kind of nice to have people actually looking back at you. Usually when you're doing television, it's just sort of this darkened studio with a couple of guys in tool belts walking around and telling you when you're live and when you're not. Literally waving at the camera like going like this to tell you that you're live, and sometimes they forget. I was doing a live show once, and literally in the commercial break, it was one of the birthdays of one of the producers up in the control room, and they came down in the commercial break and gave a piece of cake for the birthday. So I had a piece of cake in my mouth, and everyone sort of got into it. We came out of commercial break, and I was literally sitting there with a piece of cake in my mouth. And I kid you not, the segment was on childhood obesity. I wasn't quite making my case. The other thing is that you end up having to take the slides over here. I think my slides may have having a little technical difficulty, just like CNN. But you end up wearing a earpiece. You've probably seen this if you're watching television. You're wearing an earpiece in your ear, and that was probably one of the hardest things to sort of get used to, was wearing an earpiece so people can talk to you while you're talking. And it's really challenging. I sort of came to this career later on in life, and I never quite got used to it. So you're in the middle of an interview, and all of a sudden someone will sort of click into your ear and say, "You should smile more. You look too serious." That's what I got a lot anyways. I've been at this for a while now. It's been about 12 years. And it's funny, when I started, I sort of realized the devil was very much in the details in terms of how you do this. That's an earpiece, by the way. But the devil's in the details. I owned one suit only and just a couple of ties. It's all I really needed. But I realized when you're doing television pretty quickly, I get a call from one of the talent coordinators who says, you may want to invest in your wardrobe a little bit. And so now I own 4 suits. I was counting in 8 ties. It's still not a high priority for me, I guess. But I was really delighted to come here because I think I care so deeply about the same things that Frank was talking about, a lot of people in this room care about. And I'm sort of in this unique position now where I get to see the very beginnings of some of the biggest developments in medicine and health. And I get to travel all over the world in search of answers to questions that we're all trying to figure out. And also with full recognition that some of these answers come from very unexpected places. You don't always know where those answers are going to come from. So if you keep the mind open, you realize that the possibilities are endless. And when I talk to people, or try to describe what it is that we do, usually I tell them, look, there's something that is likely happening in the world somewhere that could benefit you. It could improve your life. It could make it longer. You don't always know what those things are, but we do. That's our job, and we're going to tell you. That's sort of the mission statement, I think, of a lot of journalists who work in this particular area. And I describe it as having a front row seat to some of those monumental changes that are going to determine the way that we all live and conduct our lives in the future. And I take this job very, very seriously. Over the past few years, I've started to work on lots of investigative documentaries. These are documentaries where you get to spend a great deal of time on a single topic. And it's fascinating. It's almost like getting a mini master's degree in a particular topic. So if you're all a curious person about things that are outside your primary discipline, all of a sudden you have this opportunity to learn and really dig into it and maybe even advance the knowledge that people have in this particular area. Now, we pick topics for all sorts of different reasons. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we decided to really dive into, at a broad platform level, the issue of concussions and brain injuries in a little bit. But basically, the idea that you have these criteria, picking a topic that affects a lot of people, or it affects fewer people, but much more profoundly. Sometimes there are topics that just have a gee whiz quality about them, and you cannot help but talk about them because you know everyone else will. Sometimes they are stories of people who are so triumphant that have overcome things and shown what is possible in body and spirit. And most of all, I think these are topics that just make us smarter as a society. I just like this idea of adding to the collective knowledge of our society, picking topics that are going to teach us all something, and that's really worth something to us. I want to thank Frank again, because I think the idea of having these sorts of symposiums where people do exactly that, where we actually add to the collective knowledge, hopefully get us all to a better place in our understanding, is really important. And I also think it's citizen scholarship. Citizen scholarship at its very best. I have young children now, and there's so many things that they have in terms of their own continuing education, but continuing adult education I think is really important as well. CNN is a global news network. So we get to literally search the world in search of some of these answers. And I personally have now traveled to every continent on the planet, more than 100 countries around the world. And I realize in particular with the international reporting that I do and that we do, health is one of these things that is a very, very common denominator. In order for people to understand what is happening in some of these places, health can sometimes be a valuable insight into that. I just returned from the Middle East. I was in Lebanon and Syria reporting on a civil war. And it is complicated. There are many people in this country who probably cannot identify exactly where Damascus is on a map. But they do understand the stories of real families, people who are probably surprisingly not too different from the people in this room and your neighbors. There are people who drive their kids to school, they shop at malls, they go to ATM machines, and suddenly the missiles come raining down. That's how they described it to me. And they are displaced and forced to flee and live like refugees. It's hard to imagine that happening here, but their lives, again, are not too different. When you look at that prism of things, sometimes you really understand it a lot better. So it is important to get on the ground and go to these places to be able to fully do that. And I talk to people from different disciplines, policymakers, experts, and of course the very people who are so dramatically touched by what is happening there. We go into laboratories, people's homes, we go into the middle of infectious disease outbreaks, we go into natural disasters, sometimes we go into battlefields. That came off more dramatic than I intended, actually, the battlefields. Incidentally, my wife is here. She doesn't get to do these things very often. She made me promise I would not embarrass her. She doesn't always love it when I go into battlefields. What was the word that you used last time? Stupid, I think it was. But you know, she doesn't really feel that way. We've been talking about this a lot, and she knows that these stories, again, are important to tell, again, because of what they invoke in people's emotions. Last time I went to Haiti, I was talking to her about it, and she ended our conversation by saying she wished that she could go with me. Not as my wife, but as a citizen who had been watching these things on television and so desperately wanted to help. And she knows that seeing these stories in Syria, in Haiti, in Sri Lanka, all these places I've been, are different than the other types of stories out there. And they may make you feel more compassionate, more compelled to act, and simply more connected. And that's what we're really trying to do. She also knows that I'm not a thump on your chest sort of journalist. That's not the guy that I am. I'm not the guy who sticks his head out in firefights. I'm not the guy who gratuitously puts his team at risk. I'm not the guy who takes unnecessary chances. I'm pretty methodical. I think about these things very carefully ahead of time. And there are collisions between medicine and media in this situation. For example, I think even my own surgical training sort of helps here. With surgical training, you're asking lots of questions. You are oftentimes doing lots of practice ahead of time, and you're basically trying to make sure that you can fully understand what the worst case scenarios are and what sort of exit strategy you have. And you have a lot of that in war zones. There's a lot of similarity in the way that you think about these things. It's also funny the advice that you get when you're about to do your first gig as a war reporter. Everyone had advice for me. I never imagined I'd be doing this sort of work as a war reporter. And I remember some of the advice, I wrote it down. People say, be vigilant. Make sure you have a phone that works and has GPS. Scan all of your important documents and mail them to yourself. Smile a lot and don't look suspicious. That was hard for me. You learn things that are also much more poignant. Don't ever sit at a cafe or an outdoor restaurant with your back to the street because you could be more easily kidnapped. I don't know who goes to a cafe in the middle of a war zone, but that was good advice. Have an exit strategy always, and including knowing who you can fully trust in situations like that and who you can't, and the bar should be very high. And if you do get kidnapped, you should ask your captor for something every single day. Ask them for a pillow, for a blanket, for a newspaper. They are likely to say no every single day, but it also will make them less likely to kill you, should that moment ever come. It's pretty heavy stuff. Something else I learned was to bring duct tape. You bring duct tape, it's amazing. Duct tape, you have all sorts of uses for duct tape, but this is one that even I was surprised to hear. I was told that at night you should take duct tape and actually duct tape your cash and your passport to your body. And that tip came in handy for me when I was in Haifa, Israel back in 2006. I was staying in this hotel that suddenly came under fire from these Katyusha rockets. It was in the middle of the night, we had no power, we had no lights, the elevator was not working, and I suddenly had to run. Now, I'm a boxer sort of guy, and that's all I had on, but I had developed that habit of duct taping my passport and my cash to my body. And when I ran out of the hotel and went diving into this bomb shelter, I'm pretty glad I did, because I had what I needed. A few hours later, I stepped out of the shelter, walked over to the small clothing bazaar, bought a pair of pants, a t-shirt, a pair of flip-flops, hailed a taxi, and said, take me to the airport. The advice finally came out in handy. I learned something else when I was coming back from one of these war zones. I was in Iraq a few years ago. I was dead tired, and I just fell asleep somewhere in the back of the plane. I must have been having some pretty bad dreams because I was making a lot of noise, moaning and groaning, I guess, in my sleep. And this very nice flight attendant finally came over to me and kind of woke me up, and she said, sir, you're being a little bit loud. You're disturbing the other passengers. We're going to have to move you up to first class where it's a little bit more private. Pretty good. If you ever want an upgrade, just moan in your sleep. If we have a little bit of time at the end, I'll tell you some of those stories about Iraq as well. When I think about some of the topics that you all are discussing today, when I think about some of the stories that we cover, I think it's important to sort of distinguish what is information and what is knowledge. And again, this is important, I think, as people in the healthcare field, but also certainly as reporters as well. The way that I define it, information is plentiful. There's a lot of it available, but it's not often necessarily useful. In order to be useful and helpful, it has to be contextualized in some way. It has to be made memorable. It has to be made relevant to people's lives and their worlds. With medical reports in particular, it may induce a change in their lives. It may alter their behavior in some way. It may inspire them to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have. And those are all things that we take very seriously. Sometimes those changes may be big,
Sometimes they may be small, but they're always very important. And at the core of all this, and I was listening to some of Frank's remarks, but the core of all this is story. What motivates you in the first place? What are those stories? Since I was young, I really paid a lot of attention to the idea of story. Just really understanding what that means. It really is at the heart of everything that we do. And there are some very basic rules when it comes to telling stories. If you follow those basic rules, you can let the creative juices start to really run free. Good stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Basic rule. They often have a conflict. There's often somebody who's wearing the black hat in a story. You can identify that person or that thing. A good story should explain that conflict and also explain the resolution. And if there's not a resolution, explain why there was no resolution. These are the keys to creating a good story. And if you do it right, the end product is that you take topics that may be esoteric, that may be hard to understand, and all of a sudden you make them sticky. They stick in people's minds. People will be compelled to share it with other people. And all of a sudden you create a social network like no other. Most of all, people feel smarter just for knowing that story. And we all have them. TV wouldn't work without stories. You can have the greatest content in the world, the best minds in the world, but unless people remember it, it doesn't mean much. That's where the story really brings it to life. My process is I usually mull over things for a while. I like to write. Then when I start writing, I won't really share it with anybody, and then I'll share it with Rebecca. She's usually the only person I'll share my initial thoughts with. And truth be told, my first drafts are usually really terrible. And truth be told, Rebecca has no problem telling me the truth about how terrible they are. we don't get away very much, by the way, Rebecca and I. We have 3 daughters, as I think was mentioned, and let's see if there they are. There's my daughters. That's why we don't get away. And then we say, we're going to go away for a couple of days and get away. And then, of course, like most parents in here, as soon as we get away, all we talk about is our daughters. In fact, I was remembering the story about one of our kids the other day, my middle daughter. Her name was Sky, and she was in the car with me one day. I was driving around, and it was this nice day, I remember, and I just sitting in the back in the car seat, and I caught a glimpse of her suddenly in the rearview mirror. And it was one of those moments, you know, I'm a dad. Whoa. And I was watching her, and she started to play with my stethoscope. I had a stethoscope in my back seat. All the neurosurgeons were saying, "What do you do with the stethoscope in your back seat?" Well, I have one, and she started playing with it, and she put the pieces in her ears, and she was sort of holding it, you know, like in her ears. And she was 5 years old at the time, and I was watching her going, wow, this is that moment. She's going to be a doctor. I'm going to tell people about this moment for years to come. And she gets the little piece, and she's bringing it closer and closer, and finally she goes, "Welcome to McDonald's, can I take your order?" The moments are always what you'd expect. But you know, I've been at this confluence of medicine and media for 12 years now, and it's a really fascinating place to be. Again, there's a lot of similarities. People think of these as disparate things, medicine and media, but some of the ingredients are very much the same. In both, you do a lot of homework. I work all the time. I probably do more homework now than I ever have done at any other point in my life. In both, you have the potential to improve and lengthen people's lives, and in both, credibility means everything. If you've lost any amount of credibility, if not everything. And when I started, there weren't a lot of people who did this type of work. There weren't a lot of people who I could go to and ask questions of. It was sort of a new path. There weren't a lot of roads paved. But everyone still had advice, as I mentioned. Some of the advice you'd get, just be yourself, smile more, look more serious, buy nice suits, but not too nice. Don't buy shirts that button down at the collar, they don't look good on TV. Always remember collar stays. Never wear a tie in the mornings. Always wear a tie in the mornings. Purple is apparently a good color, and royal blue for television. Orange is death. That made it really challenging when my oldest daughter bought me an orange tie and then literally watched every day to see if I would wear this thing. I remember another piece of advice I got was to be self-deprecating. Be self-deprecating. It's always funny when people give you advice like that. Be self-deprecating. Make fun of myself because it is funny or because it is true. I wasn't sure. But when I told Rebecca about this, be self-deprecating, she immediately, yes, you should be self-deprecating. No doubt there. In fact, I was telling her about today's talk, and she said, you should tell a joke about neurosurgeons. I said, there are no jokes about neurosurgeons. She said, I will find you one. And she did, so here, it's pretty sweet. A man's at the hospital, and the doctor comes out to talk to the family and says, look, your loved one is very ill. We're not quite sure what's we can do for them, but we think one thing may possibly work, and that is to do a brain transplant. So, why are you doing brain transplants now? Yes. We're doing brain transplants, but they are very expensive and insurance doesn't cover them. So, well, how much is it? I said it's $500,000 for a male brain and $250,000 for a female brain. And all the men in the family nodded as if this was the most obvious thing they'd ever heard. And finally, one young woman speaks up and she says, well, hang on a second, Doc. How come it's so much cheaper for a female brain? And without skipping a beat, the doctor says, well, that's easy. They're discounted for having been previously used. She thought that was going the other way, right? She says she can tell me a joke about neurosurgeons, and instead it's about all men, apparently. But over the past years, we've done these documentaries, these investigative reports on all sorts of different topics that I find fascinating. Prescription drug overdoses, for example, now the #1 cause of preventable death in this country, even surpassing car accidents recently. The crusade against heart disease. I have a strong family history of heart disease, and I really wanted to know what can we reliably say about preventing heart disease? There's a lot out there. How do you distill through that and say, look, I don't want to have a heart attack. I don't want to have heart disease, and I want some guarantees. With all that we know, what sort of guarantees can be given to me? These are things that I wanted to know and then to teach the audience. And as I mentioned, some of the stories are just really triumphant stories as well. One of my favorite people recently, this documentary that we did was about Diana Nyad. Some of you may know her. She ended up swimming here to Florida. But frankly, she's one of the reasons that I do this sort of work, this opportunity to meet people like her. I call her inspiration personified. She was a swimmer in her late 20s who tries to break a world record by swimming from Cuba to Florida, and she fails. And she gives up for nearly 30 years at that time. But she realizes something else at that point, and that is that she never let go of her dream. She never let go of her dream, and that's what this story was really about, because it's universal. So many people probably in this room have felt that way at one time or another. You had dreams, you go through life, there's all these things that you wanted to do, learn to play a new sport, write a book, climb a mountain, whatever it may be, but time goes on and you think, I'm going to have to let that one go. That one's not for me. And that was Diana too. Then she turned 60 years old, and 30 years of her life was gone in a flash. And she decided now, you know what, it's not too late, I'm going to chase this dream with reckless abandon and do something that no one had ever done in the world before. And it scared her. And she started swimming. She hadn't done it, she started swimming, and she used to do these 24-hour training swims. It's the most incredible thing. She was 60 years old. And then 3 separate times after the age of 60, she tried to do this. Swim from Cuba to Florida, and every single time she failed. It was amazing. A few weeks ago, she sent me this note. And she said, the conditions are perfect. I've been training a lot and I feel ready. I'm going to do it again. And something about the way that she was communicating this to me made me jump on a plane, fly to Key West, and see what would happen. And as you may know, she did it. It was amazing. She swam for 53 hours without stopping through these shark and jellyfish infested waters between Cuba and Florida. 110 miles is what she swam. And she is 64 years old. It's the most amazing thing. And I realized with this type of story that as much as we talk about what is happening in the world of longevity from a scientific basis, as much as we talk about the things that can lengthen your life from a medical basis, it would be Diana's story or stories like Diana that would make it resonate like nothing else. People watch a story like hers and they say, she's 64 years old. She can do this. I sure as heck can do this at the age of 44 or 54 or even 74. And now's the time for me to learn not just how to fight disease, but how to prevent it in the first place, how to optimize my health as opposed to just playing defense on this. This was just a few hours after she finished. It's amazing. She decided to sit down and talk to me. It was just a few hours after swimming 53 hours. And you can see her mouth is pretty swollen there, some of it from the jellyfish sting, some of it from these devices she wore to protect herself. And we just had this about an hour-long conversation. And I remember asking her, what was different? Why did you succeed when you had failed so many times before? And she said what was going through her mind was, I just need to find a way. I just need to find a way to get through this, to get through the suffering. And it was remarkable what she was able to do. And again, she's one of the reasons that I do this type of work. We recently did a documentary called Weed, and it ended up being one of the most watched documentaries in CNN's history, which frankly may say more about our audience than it does the quality of the documentary. But all kidding aside, I walked into this documentary with my eyes pretty wide open, and I was quite stunned at what I found. And this is, again, one of those things that requires a little bit of digging below the surface. Up until 1943 in this country, marijuana was on the formulary in hospitals and in pharmacies. And then within a couple of decades, it went to being a Schedule I substance, which meant that it was considered a drug now of high abuse and something that had no medicinal potential. And you realized, when you look at the science, not just in the United States, but around the world, that was such an arbitrary classification, and that people could be getting denied an important treatment option. I'll tell you, I was very dismissive of this whole thing for a long time. I've been reporting on this issue for a long time. I wrote columns in magazines, including this one in Time magazine a few years ago, basically saying I didn't think there was anything there. But as I started to dig deep, I realized that, like most people, I had lumped legitimate patients together with high visibility malingerers who were just looking to get high. And there's certainly people like that, but what about those legitimate patients? There are patients out there for whom nothing else works. And I thought it was really important that we actually provide this sort of knowledge to try and advance that discussion. We got a chance to tell some of their stories. Our paths crossed today here because of another investigation that we worked on for some time regarding these types of brain injuries and concussions. And we're talking specifically about sports with our documentary called Big Hits, Broken Dreams. This was right up my alley as a doctor, as a reporter, as a football fan. It was also an example of an emerging science, something that even people who dedicated their lives to this didn't necessarily know, because nobody knew before some of the science started to emerge. But yet it was something that could profoundly affect so many people within our society, such a common injury that we all should be educated about. There are over 2 million of these types of concussions, brain injuries every year, which is just an extraordinary number. 2 million of anything. It's an extraordinary number, and if you think about it, most of them are totally preventable. So we decided to revolve our documentary around a particular story, a story of one high school, J.H. Rose High School in Greenville, North Carolina, and around a particular player whose name is Jaquan Waller.
Here it is, my little brother. He's not moving. He needs help breathing. I just lost him.
Waller was tackled, walked to the sidelines, didn't collapse.
Friday night's death of Jaquan Waller is being felt across.
It's a very tough time for the whole community.
So we had a tragedy, and it really brought it all to the forefront.
How important is it to have athletic trainers at these football games?
Would you drop a child off at a pool or an ocean that did not have a lifeguard? People are starting to take a different look at how important health and safety is for athletes.
6 concussions.
6.
I remember getting hit hard. That actually rang my bell.
For the first 3 weeks, it was just a constant headache. The trainer was asking questions and answering them all wrong.
What we're seeing here, is this definitely caused by blows to the head?
When my son can't remember stuff, I think that, it's my fault.
There are a small percentage of impacts that simulate that car crash.
He does have symptoms of a concussion.
A parent came to you and said, Coach, my kid really wants to play football, but I want you to tell me that he's going to be safe. I can't guarantee that. That is a violent game. That's always going to be there. Can you make this game safer?
There's a collision between the culture around this and obviously the type of injury. And that is something that we all deal with, I think, certainly in the medical community who really care about this particular issue. We've known about concussions and early descriptions of it for a long time, including back to the Hippocratic Corpus, which was some of the earliest medical works from Greece, and they described it at that point as commotio cerebri. You'll forgive me if you talked about this before, but commotio cerebri literally meant commotion of the brain. And they talked about some of the symptoms and some of the ways that patients would behave even back then. What really struck home for me was I remember I was sitting in my backyard one day and I was talking to my kids, and my neighbor literally jumped over the fence and brought a young man over with him who was a high school football player. Very nice guy, very charismatic, and handsome guy. And we were talking for a while, and within a few minutes of talking to him, I realized that this is a guy who really had no memory. His memory had been completely altered, and he was having a hard time simply maintaining conversation, even though just looking at him, you would have no idea. And I started talking about it, and you realize that he was someone who had suffered from a few concussions during the previous football season, these types of brain injuries. And that got me thinking about whether we should do a deeper dive into this topic. I started talking to researchers literally all over the country, and realized that as much as we talk about people at the NFL level, what was the impact on younger people? What was the impact on high school level players? And was any of that really objective? How much of that was going to be something that they would carry around with them for their entire lives? And that was something that we decided to really focus on, particularly with a young man named Nathan Stiles. Take a look.
The thing is, Nathan didn't start football until he was in 7th grade because he didn't want to get hurt.
Nathan being escorted by his parents.
Their 17-year-old son Nathan was a star running back for the Spring Hill Broncos in Kansas. It was October 28, 2010, the last game of his senior year, the best game of his career. He ran for 2 touchdowns, 165 yards in just the first 2 quarters. And then 2 minutes before halftime, he walked off the field, screamed that his head hurt, and he collapsed. Nathan died early the next morning. And like Jaquan, Nathan died of second impact syndrome. Earlier in the month at a homecoming game, he got a concussion. Everyone, including Nathan's doctor, thought it had healed.
Did you get angry at all, Ron?
No, I just, it was just you're in shock.
I couldn't look at this book for a long time.
I know.
The Stiles would find meaning in Nathan's tragic death because of this one.
I think the last time you were here, we had maybe 5 brains,
Right.
and now we're in the 90s.
Dr. Ann McKee runs the world's largest brain bank. It's a joint project between the Veterans Administration and Boston University. I first met her several years ago when she began finding evidence in the brains of deceased NFL players of unnatural tau protein deposits. Those are the same kinds of proteins found in Alzheimer's patients. It's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's a progressive degenerative disease which leads to dementia and Alzheimer's-like symptoms. But the difference is these symptoms are usually found in people in their 80s, not their 40s.
What we're seeing here, is this definitely caused by blows to the head?
It's never been seen in any reported case, except in the case of repeated blows to the head.
And that's exactly what the Stiles wanted to know when they donated Nathan's brain to McKee Center. Did repeated blows to the brain cause that kind of damage in young Nathan's brain? And the answer was yes. Under the microscope,
That's really obvious, Dr. McKee.
we saw telltale signs of tau protein.
Did this surprise you?
Yes, it definitely did. It can start very early.
That's amazing.
yeah.
17 years old.
17.
And for the first time, Dr. McKee is about to show Nathan's parents what she found.
Hi, Ann McKee. How do you do?
Meet you.
Nothing Ann McKee is about to tell them will bring Nathan back.
And this is looking at it under the microscope and seeing all those dark brown.
But the Stiles hope that this rare gift will teach us more about brain concussions than we've ever known before.
We have all the confidence in the world. There's something to be learned from it. It's in the right place here to do just that.
I think I want it to be my life's mission, to make sure this doesn't happen to other kids.
McKee knows how much more vulnerable these young kids may be. When the young developing brain is hit during football, no matter how hard, the brain is rocked. It's like an egg inside a shell. It stretches, the delicate fibers pulled, fluids violently sloshed around the brain trying to absorb the blow.
Youth are at risk for any changes in that fluid balance, and they may not be able to handle it as well.
Sounds like you're saying they're more at risk than adults.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is important. No matter how good a helmet is, it can't completely protect a brain from this sort of trauma.
Some of the helmets can slow down the impact, but I think ultimately a helmet won't completely solve this problem. I think we're going to have to do rule changes and game changes in addition to equipment changes.
Like penalties for leading with the hand, banning helmet-to-helmet contact from practice, even moving forward the kickoff line to minimize collisions. McKee wants changes like these, and that's why people call her one of the football killers, because they think if you're going to make these changes, you're going to change the game forever.
I'm a huge football fan. I grew up right outside of Green Bay in the Vince Lombardi area, so it's instilled in my DNA. I don't like seeing this happen to them, so I'm for changing whatever changes we need to make to keep these guys safe and healthy.
And again, you hear her talking there at the end about this idea of the collision between the culture and what we know about the science behind these concussions, these types of brain injuries. It's difficult, but these stories, I think, really, again, stick in people's minds. And the question that we started asking ourselves in the process of making this documentary is, can you make football safer and still have it be football? Now, and it's a question that a lot of people are obviously weighing in on. And what exactly are the types of forces that the brain takes, that the head takes, and what are the things that can be done to best mitigate those things as well? We've got a guy named Kevin Guskowitz who has literally dedicated his life to this sort of work. Some of you in this room may have heard or know of his research, but he's a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient who received that grant basically to study exactly what many of you in this room have been talking about for some time, and using his talents to really look at what happens to the brain during those hits and understand what forces are the worst types of forces, and most importantly, what can be done about this. I just want you to listen to a couple things he says.
When you leave this field today, that you never again use the word ding or bell ringer. And if you hear a teammate using that, if you hear a coach using that, if you hear your athletic trainer using that, you say, you mean a brain injury.
He travels the country, educating everyone from the NFL to local high school players, parents, and coaches on how to prevent head injuries.
So it's helmet impact telemetry? Is that what
yes.
HIT system?
HIT system.
I met him at a nearby football safety clinic.
This shows 6 single-axis accelerometers in the helmets.
It's collecting the data.
It's collecting the data, and it's all communicated through this receiver here. This would be set up on the sideline.
Let's try this. And I'm going to give it sort of a moderate hit here and see what happens.
So it's recorded up here at 23.6 Gs of acceleration.
He showed me how hard these hits really are.
He's going to withstand an impact, 157 Gs.
Ooh. Wow.
What we see is impacts to the crown of the head are about over 3 times more likely to result in an impact greater than 80 Gs.
And again, that's similar to a car accident.
Right. The question becomes how many of those big impacts and the subconcussive ones can a player withstand over the course of a season or a career until there's some cumulative damage.
Subconcussive blows are the everyday hits, small hits. They don't cause concussions. An average high school player sustains more than 650 of these hits per season.
You're talking about people in their young, in their 40s, developing dementia, almost Alzheimer's-like diseases. It could be a result of many smaller hits over their career.
A series of those subconcussive insults to the head that add up over time.
I show you these clips in part to show you take some again, what might be considered esoteric topics or principles in isolation and try and string them together in a way that people will really truly understand that a concussion is a brain injury, that there are ramifications of these subconcussive injuries, and we have objective evidence of what all of that looks like. Again, the CTE that you heard Ann McKee, one of the pioneers in this type of research, talking about, that's what it looks like. You see what a normal brain looks like on the left. You see what a brain looks like, somebody who has Alzheimer's in the middle, and then CTE. And again, this is something that will really stick in people's minds, that triad of symptoms of rage and depression and memory loss. You know, I think I heard earlier Frank asking people in this room how they talk about concussions, how they describe it, what you would tell your patients specifically about it. And it's amazing, we did some of the same sort of polling. We talked to neurologists, neurosurgeons over the country. How do you talk about concussions to your patients? And it can be a complicated thing sometimes. I don't think it's a concussion, although the smoke has me a little concerned. It's part of the issue, that sometimes the descriptions are vague, even among people within our own community. So how do you describe concussion? How do you educate people that this type of brain injury, that they've in fact suffered it, and what they're going to do about it? How do you tell them that somehow their brain is now changed in a way that the way that they perceive the world is somehow altered? that they may have blurriness of vision, they may have ringing in their ears, they may have headache, they may have numbness, they may have all sorts of different symptoms, but the rest of the world now seems altered as a result of this concussion. And that's part of what we try and do with these documentaries, is really educate people about that. Also educate them about the different types of forces, making them realize that it's not just the linear force, but also the rotational force that seems to be so much more important when it comes to these types of brain injuries in terms of its severity, and looking at what happens to specifically the brainstem, the midbrain, and the reticular activating system when someone takes a blow like that, and why there are so many of these types of injuries in boxing, for example, versus football. This is what we try and do. You know, probably a lot of people in the room, some of the changes that have taken place now within football, specifically looking at what happens to players if they are suspected of having had this type of concussion, the type of scanning that goes on the sideline. It's pretty involved. I went through it myself a few times just to get an idea. These aren't simple neurological exams. The SCAT exam there is something that takes 10 to 15 minutes and does involve quite a bit of history and neurological examination. So there are things that are being done about this, but this is an example, again, of my worlds as a neurosurgeon and as a reporter sort of colliding. It's something that I really enjoy doing. And again, there are examples of that all over our reporting over the last 12 years. When I was in Iraq in 2003, I was embedded with this group of doctors who are colloquially known as the Devil Docs. The Devil Docs. They are naval doctors who travel with the Marines, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. And these guys start traveling with the Marines, literally piggybacking around the battlefield, because they realized during the Gulf War of '91, it was simply taking too long to get the injured back to some sort of definitive care. So they decided in 2003 they were going to move some of those medical capabilities far forward. And in fact, it was called a Forward Resuscitative Surgical Suite, FRSS. That's where I was embedded for quite some time. And I remember it was sometime in the spring of 2003, it was one of these days where a Chamal sandstorm had come in. And a Chamal sandstorm is one of the most unbelievable things, if you've ever seen it. It's sand that just seemingly comes for forever, and you cannot see anything. And from our standpoint, it meant that we had no air protection as we were sitting there exposed on that battlefield in Iraq. And it was a day like that these naval doctors, who I've gotten to know now over a few weeks of being embedded there, came up to me and said, hey, we got a guy, a lieutenant, who was injured, and they're bringing him in, and I'm wondering if you can literally take off your journalist cap and put on your surgeon's cap and give us a hand, because there weren't any neurosurgeons in that particular area of the battlefield. The lieutenant's name is Jesus Vidana, and he comes in, and at the time, the story goes, he was on patrol. It was a really hot day. He was outside of Baghdad, took his helmet off for just a brief moment, probably to wipe the sweat from his hair, and he got shot by a sniper right here. And they examined him. They thought he was dead, and as the Marines like to euphemistically say, they cleaned up the place, and then they went back and got Jesus' body. They brought him in, and when we examined him there, away from the cacophony of that battlefield, found he did have a pulse, needed an operation, which was to basically decompress his brain. So that's what I did. I was asked to do that. Decompressed his brain, took out a big hematoma that was forming there in that posterior area, and then we took an IV bag, which was the only sterile thing in that dusty desert tent, opened it up, filleted it, and basically used that to create the outer layer of his brain, his dura. Wrapped him up, put him on a Black Hawk helicopter, and I wasn't sure that I'd ever hear from him again. And I remember I was in my office a few months later, and I get a call from a 619 area code. And the guy, I answer the phone, the guy says, this Dr. Gupta, I have an update on one of your patients. And I said, I think you might have the wrong Dr. Gupta. As it turns out, there's quite a few of us. He said, no, I think I got the right guy. Do you remember operating on Jesus Vidana in Iraq? And I said, how could I forget operating on Jesus in the middle of the desert? And I didn't know what he was going to say. I didn't know how Jesus had done. And he said, he's doing pretty well. He's got a little left hand weakness, but he's doing pretty well. If you are in Southern California, you should come pay him a visit. So I decided to do that. I was in Southern California, and I said, looked up Jesus, and I went to his house, called him up ahead of time, went to his house, and I remember he answered the door, and I had never seen him, but sort of beaten and battered on that desert floor, and he's this handsome guy. He answers the door, and he comes over and gives me this big hug, and we're talking, just like we're old friends. And his mother comes out of the house a little while later, and she says, are you the guy that operated on my son? And I said, yes, I am. And she kind of takes my hand. She's very sweet. She says, thank you. A little while later, Dad comes out. And dads and moms are a little different. He comes out and he goes, you the guy that operated my son? I said, yes, sir, I am. And he said, and you're a journalist? Hadn't got the whole story there. We ended up having this conversation about what had happened. And it was kind of amazing, the relationships between fathers and sons. I remember I was sitting there and I realized that we were now having a conversation that they had not yet had. It was the most transformative thing that he had probably been through in his entire life, but they hadn't really sat down and talked about it. And I was asking his father, I said, well, what did you know or what did you think when Jesus went off to war? And he said, look, he goes, I did not know what to think. I mean, we went out to dinner the night before, went to Olive Garden. I still remember him telling me where they went. And he said, we sat there and Jesus said, look, I'll be back in probably a few weeks. I don't think anything's going to happen. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. That was essentially what he heard. And he said, the only time you worry about me is if a car pulls up to the front of the house and a couple guys in uniforms get out. Then you worry. That means I'm dead. They were joking. They didn't think it could ever happen. So Jesus' father's telling me this, and he says he's sitting in his house one day. The storm door's open, but the screen door's still closed. It's morning time, and he's looking out the door, and he sees a car pull up to the front of the house, and two guys in uniforms get out. And he can't do anything. These guys come up to the door, and they're knocking. He can see them, and they can see him, but he's paralyzed. He can't even move. Because that's the only thing he remembered about the conversation he had with his son before he left. And eventually his mom went and opened the door, and they found out that Jesus had been injured but was still alive. And I realized that we were having a conversation that had not been had, and that somehow we were nurturing and fostering something that may be one of the most important things for this father and son. So having those conversations, telling those stories, providing hopefully some education and knowledge along the way, it's what we do. And I wanted to give you today some examples of how we do it. Thank you so much for having me.